The hangar was silent except for the faint creak of an old wrench twisting against rusted metal. Dust floated in the sunlight that cut through broken windows, falling over the faded silver skin of a once mighty bird, the P-51 Mustang. Beside it stood an old man in a weathered leather jacket, sleeves rolled up, grease staining his trembling hands. His name was Walt Henson, 82 years old, and the men on the base thought he'd lost his mind. To them, he was just another retired veteran chasing ghosts. To him, that plane wasn't just a relic, it was his heart. "Hey, look at Grandpa over there trying to rebuild World War II, one young airman joked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Laughter rippled through the hangar. Walt didn't react. He kept tightening the bolt on the Mustang's landing gear, his focus unbroken. But behind his silence was pain, not from the teasing, but from the memory of the last time he'd seen this aircraft soaring in the sky, carrying his best friend into a mission that never returned. It had been nearly 60 years since Walt last touched a P-51. He had been just 21 then, the youngest pilot in his squadron. He and his co-pilot, Charlie Dawson, had nicknamed their plane Lucy Bell after Charlie's sweetheart back home. The war ended, but Charlie didn't come back. Walt always blamed himself after retirement. When most veterans spent their days fishing or playing cards, Walt bought the rusting frame of a P-51 from a scrapyard. Everyone said it was impossible to restore. The engine was dead, wings bent, cockpit shattered. But Walt believed if he could bring this bird back to life, maybe he could finally find peace. Every morning before sunrise, Walt would drive to the airfield, dragging his worn toolbox. The younger airmen, all half his age, watched him with disbelief. They were busy maintaining modern jets, F-16s and Raptors, machines built for speed and war. To them, this old plane was ancient history, but one man noticed differently. Lieutenant Jason Carter, 27 years old, a decorated pilot himself. He saw something in Walt's movements, the way his hands trembled not from weakness but from memory. One afternoon, Carter approached him. "Sir, may I ask, why this plane?" Walt smiled faintly, brushing metal shavings from his hands. "Because it's the last thing that still remembers the men we lost." Carter didn't know what to say. The depth in Walt's eyes carried decades of unspoken grief and pride. From that day, Carter stopped the jokes. He even started bringing tools, quietly helping after his shift. Weeks turned into months. The restoration was a battle of its own, sourcing rare parts, rebuilding the Merlin engine, sanding the corroded wings. Walt's body wasn't as strong as it once was. Sometimes, he'd collapse onto the concrete floor, gasping from fatigue. Carter would rush to help, insisting he take a break, but Walt always refused. "If I stop now," he'd whisper, "then Charlie stays gone." One night, the storm outside battered the hangar roof. Rain poured in through holes in the ceiling, soaking everything. The wind howled like ghosts. Walt was alone again, tightening a final bolt on the left wing when his hand slipped. The wrench fell, and he lost his balance. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder. He lay there for a long moment, staring up at the dark ceiling. "Maybe they're right," he muttered. "Maybe this old man's chasing shadows." But then his eyes drifted toward the faded emblem on the plane's nose, a painted pin-up girl with the words Lucy Bell. Tears welled in his eyes. He crawled to his knees, whispering, "Not yet, Charlie, not yet." The next morning, Lieutenant Carter found him asleep beside the plane. Instead of stopping him, Carter called in a few friends from the base, men who'd laughed before. Quietly, one by one, they began to help. Someone welded the tail, another sanded the propeller. Even the base commander eventually noticed. Within weeks, the hangar buzzed with energy. The same airmen who once mocked him were now working under his guidance, learning about the old engine's mechanics and flight control systems. Walt's tired eyes lit up each time the P-51 began to resemble her former glory. The day finally came when the engine was ready to be tested. The entire crew gathered outside the hangar, unsure if it would even turn over. Walt climbed up into the cockpit, his hands shaking not from fear, but from memory. Carter stood beside the propeller, hand raised in salute. Walt took a deep breath, flipped a series of switches, and pressed the starter. The propeller spun once, twice, then roared to life. The sound, the deep, throaty growl of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, echoed across the airfield like thunder. The young airman froze. The laughter that once filled the hangar was gone, replaced by awe. Tears streamed down Walt's wrinkled face as he revved the throttle gently. For a moment, time folded back. He was 21 again, heart pounding, sky calling. The base commander stepped forward. "Mr. Henson," he said, voice steady. "You've done the impossible. That aircraft belongs in a museum." Walt smiled faintly. "No, sir. She belongs in the sky. The commander hesitated but finally nodded. They granted permission for one ceremonial flight, just a short takeoff and landing, with Lieutenant Carter as co-pilot. The day of the flight, hundreds gathered around the runway, civilians, veterans, and airmen. As Walt climbed into the cockpit wearing his old flight jacket, Carter noticed something on his chest, a set of combat wings, gleaming silver against the worn leather. He realized at that moment that the old man before him wasn't just a mechanic, he was a legend. Sir, Carter said quietly, you were a Mustang pilot? Walt smiled. Was and always will be. The engine thundered to life again. The propeller blurred, dust swirling around the plane. Slowly, the P-51 began to roll forward. The crowd erupted in cheers. Walt gripped the stick, eyes fixed on the horizon. The wheels left the ground, and the Mustang soared into the open blue, climbing higher and higher, sunlight reflecting off her polished wings. For a few minutes, she danced again, just as she had decades ago, proud, fearless, alive. As they touched down, the crowd roared. Carter climbed out, helping Walt down. The old man's legs trembled, but his eyes sparkled with the kind of peace that had eluded him for 60 years. Thank you, Carter said softly, for showing us what true courage looks like. Walt looked back at the plane and whispered, she's home now. That night, Walt sat on a bench near the hangar, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and red. For the first time in decades, his heart was light. The ghosts were gone when the sun dipped below the horizon. Walt smiled and closed his eyes. He passed quietly, still wearing his flight jacket, with a photograph of Lucy Bell's crew tucked in his pocket. Weeks later, during the base's annual airshow, Lieutenant Carter led a formation of jets as a P-51 Mustang, freshly painted and gleaming, flew alongside them. On her side, the name Lucy Bell shimmered under the sunlight. As they passed overhead, Carter's voice broke over the radio, for Walter Henson, the man who reminded us that true heroes never fade. And below, every airman on the tarmac stood at attention, saluting the sky, where an old pilot finally found his peace.